The stars were dying. At least, that was how Admiral Desara Vaughn saw it as she stood on the bridge of her flagship, the VSS Eternal Vigil. Through the massive viewing window, she could see the Crimson Nebula stretching across space like a wound in the universe. It was beautiful. It was also the place where civilization would make its last stand. The Valorian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. They had built wonders that touched the edges of known space. They had brought peace to 40,000 star systems. They had watched younger species grow and guided them toward the light of civilization. Now, all of that was ending. Desara was old for her kind. 200 years of service had turned her blue skin pale and her silver hair white. She had fought in dozens of battles and won most of them. But this battle was different. This battle could not be won. Admiral, her second-in-command, called out. His voice was tight with fear he was trying to hide. The long-range sensors have confirmed the enemy fleet. 3,000 vessels. They will reach us in 6 hours. 3,000. Desara looked at her own fleet displayed on the tactical screen. 200 ships. 200 against 3,000. The mathematics of death were simple and cruel. The enemy was called the Kethvori. They were not like other species. They did not want territory or resources or slaves. They wanted only one thing: to consume. They were a hive mind, billions of creatures sharing one terrible hunger. Their ships were grown from living tissue and dark metal. Their soldiers were nightmares made real. For the past century, the Kethvori had swept across 3 galaxies. Empire after empire had fallen before them. Species that had existed for millions of years were now extinct. The Valorians had thought themselves safe. They had thought their technology and their fleets would protect them. They had been wrong. Send a message to Ethoria, Desara said quietly. Tell the Emperor that we will hold the line for as long as we can. Tell him to evacuate as many people as possible. The communications officer nodded and turned to his console. Desara walked to the window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, evacuation ships were already fleeing. Millions of her people were running into the darkness, hoping to find some corner of the universe where the Kethvori would not follow. Most of them would fail. An hour later, the Emperor's face appeared on the main screen. Valdros III was young, barely a century old. His golden eyes were filled with a sadness that no ruler should ever have to feel. Admiral Vaughn, he said, I have received your message. I want you to know that your sacrifice will never be forgotten. The Valorian people will remember you as heroes. Desara bowed her head. Thank you, Your Majesty. We will buy you as much time as we can. I know you will. The Emperor paused. His voice broke slightly as he spoke again. I have just finished recording a message for our people. A farewell. I never thought I would have to say goodbye to an entire civilization. Perhaps some will survive, Majesty. Perhaps they will rebuild. Perhaps. The Emperor did not sound like he believed it. May the stars guide you, Admiral. May they guide us all. The screen went dark. Desara stood in silence for a long moment. Around her, her crew worked at their stations. They all knew they were going to die. None of them ran. None of them begged. They simply did their duty. She had never been more proud of them. The hours passed slowly. Desara used the time to walk through her ship, speaking to her crew, sharing meals with them, listening to their stories. A young weapons officer told her about the daughter he would never see grow up. An old engineer showed her pictures of the garden she had kept on her home world. A pilot barely out of training asked her if dying would hurt. Only for a moment, Desara told him. And then you will be free. When the enemy finally appeared, it was like watching a plague spread across the stars. The Kethvori fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. 3,000 ships, each one a twisted thing of organic matter and dark metal. They moved with the terrible unity of the hive mind, a single will controlling thousands of vessels. "All ships, defensive formation," the Tsara commanded. Her voice was calm. Her hands were steady. "We fight for every second. We fight for every soul that escapes. We fight because that is what we do." Her fleet responded with perfect discipline. 200 ships arranged themselves into a wall of metal and energy. Weapons charged. Shields activated. Prayers were whispered in 100 different languages. The Kethvori began their approach. They did not bother to communicate. They never did. To them, the Valorians were simply food that had not yet been eaten. The Tsar was about to give the order to fire when her sensor officer made a strange sound. It was not fear. It was confusion. "Admiral," he said, "something is happening behind the enemy fleet." The Tsara turned to look at the tactical display. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. A tear had opened in space itself, a swirling vortex of light and energy. It was a hyperspace corridor, but it was not like any she had ever seen. It was wild, unstable, and utterly uncharted. Then the ships began to pour through. They were small. That was the first thing the Tsara noticed. The largest of them was barely the size of a Valorian cruiser. They were also ugly, all sharp angles and brutal lines, nothing like the elegant curves of Valorian design. They looked like they had been built for one purpose only: war. There were thousands of them. They kept coming and coming, spreading out behind the Kethvori fleet like a second army appearing from nowhere. The Kethvori noticed them too. The hive mind paused, its attention divided. A portion of the swarm began to turn, orienting itself toward this new threat. "Admiral," the sensor officer said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Those ships do not match any known design. They are not in any of our databases. We have no idea who they are or where they came from." The Tsara stared at the display. Her 200 ships, 3,000 Kethvori vessels, and now this unknown fleet arriving from nowhere with numbers that seemed to grow by the second. "What in the void is that?" she whispered. No one had an answer. The universe had just become a much stranger place. The bridge of the Eternal Vigil had become very quiet. Every officer stood frozen at their station, watching the tactical display as the unknown fleet continued to grow. 2,000 ships, then 2,500. They spread across space like a dark cloud, positioning themselves directly behind the Kethvori swarm. "Analysis," the Tsara demanded. "Tell me something useful." Her tactical officer worked furiously at his console. "The ships are small, Admiral. Most appeared to be what we would classify as destroyers and frigates. I count only about 50 vessels large enough to be considered capital ships. Their hull composition is strange. Heavy metals, dense alloys. They are built like fortresses. Weapons? Unknown. I am detecting what appear to be kinetic launch systems. Railguns, maybe. Also some kind of missile tubes." The officer shook his head in disbelief. "Admiral, these are primitive weapons. They use physical projectiles and explosive warheads. They should be useless against modern shields." The Tsara frowned. A fleet of thousands using weapons that belonged in a museum. It made no sense. But something told her that these strangers had not come all this way to lose. The Kethvori made their decision. The hive mind divided its forces with cold precision. 1,000 vessels continued toward the Valorian fleet. The remaining 2,000 turned to face the newcomers. In the logic of the swarm, this was simple mathematics. Crush the small threat quickly, then finish the meal. "The Kethvori are engaging the unknown fleet," the sensor officer reported. 1,000 ships holding position against us. 2,000 moving to intercept the strangers. They think it will be easy. the Tsara said softly. They think primitive weapons mean a primitive enemy. The first shots came from the unknown fleet. The Tsara watched the display as thousands of small dots raced across the gap between the two forces. Missiles. Thousands upon thousands of missiles, launched in a coordinated wave that darkened the sensors. The Kethvari responded, as they always did. Point defense systems activated. Bioorganic turrets sprayed acid and plasma into the void, destroying hundreds of missiles before they could reach their targets. The hive mind calculated a 97% interception rate. Acceptable losses, but the missiles kept coming. Wave after wave, an endless storm of metal and fire. And then the Tsara saw something that made her blood run cold. The missiles that got through were not bouncing off the Kethvari shields. They were punching straight through them. How is that possible? Her tactical officer gasped. Those are just nuclear warheads. Simple fission weapons. They should not be able to penetrate bioorganic armor. The Tsara watched as a Kethvari cruiser broke apart under the assault. Then another. Then 3 more. The unknown fleet was not just fighting the swarm. They were tearing it to pieces. The warheads, she said slowly, understanding coming to her. Look at the yield. They are not using normal nuclear weapons. They have found a way to enhance the explosive force. And the missiles themselves are moving too fast. Much too fast. The unknown fleet closed the distance with terrifying speed. Their ships moved in perfect coordination, each vessel knowing exactly where it needed to be. But it was not the coordination of a hive mind. It was something else. Something more flexible, more adaptive, that the Kethvari tried to adjust. The swarm changed its formation, attempting to surround the smaller fleet. But the strangers seemed to know what they would do before they did it. They split into smaller groups, hitting the swarm from multiple angles, never staying in one place long enough to be trapped. 90 minutes. That was all it took. In 90 minutes, 1,000 Kethvari ships had been reduced to burning wreckage. The unknown fleet had lost perhaps 200 vessels. And here was the thing that frightened the Tsara most of all. The losses did not slow them down. If anything, they seemed to fight harder. Admiral, a young voice called out. It was the junior analyst, a woman barely 50 years old. Her hands were shaking as she worked at her console. I found something. In the deep archives. A match for those ship designs. Show me. The analyst transferred her findings to the main screen. The Tsara saw images of ships that looked similar to the ones fighting the Kethvari. Not identical, but close enough. The designs were old. Very old. 8,000 years ago, the analyst said. The Valorian Empire discovered a species on the outer rim. They called themselves humans. They came from a small yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. I've never heard of them, the Tsara said. No one has, Admiral. That is because the Empire quarantined them. The records say they were too primitive for uplift. But that was not the real reason. The analyst swallowed hard. The real reason was that they were considered too violent, too dangerous. The Empire decided it was better to seal them away than to let them join the galactic community. The Tsara stared at the screen. 8,000 years. These humans had been locked away for 8,000 years, forgotten by the rest of the universe. And now they had returned. How did they get out? She asked. The quarantine field, the analyst said. It was powered by stations throughout the Empire. When the Kethvari began destroying our worlds, the field must have weakened. Eventually, it failed completely. On the tactical display, the battle continued. The Kethvari were retreating now. Actually retreating. In all her years of war, the Tsara had never seen the swarm run from anything. They did not know fear. They did not understand the concept of defeat. And yet here they were, pulling back from these primitive, forgotten creatures. "Admiral," the sensor officer said. His voice was barely a whisper. "The Kethvari are trying to disengage. They are actually running away." The Zara watched as the unknown fleet, the human fleet, pursued them without mercy. There was no hesitation in their movements. No pause to celebrate their victory. They simply continued killing, hunting down every fleeing ship with cold efficiency. "What have we awakened?" she murmured. The junior analyst looked at her with wide eyes. "Admiral, I do not think we awakened them. I think they were always awake. I think they have been watching, waiting, and now they have decided to act." The Kethvari swarm that had been holding position against the Valorian fleet began to move. Not toward them, away. They were abandoning the attack, fleeing to join their retreating brothers. For the first time in a century, the Valorian Empire was not being hunted. But as this Zara watched the human fleet tear through the swarm, she was not sure if this was salvation or simply a different kind of doom. "Open a channel to the unknown fleet," she ordered. "Let us find out who our rescuers are." She hoped they would answer. She was not entirely sure she wanted them to. Fleet Admiral James Chun stood on the bridge of the U.E.S. Thermopylae with his hands clasped behind his back. Through the forward view screen, he watched the Kethvari ships burn. Each explosion was a small victory. Each destroyed vessel was just as delayed, but finally delivered. He was 62 years old, ancient by the standards of a combat officer. His black hair had turned gray at the temples. His face was lined with the marks of too many battles and too little sleep. But his eyes were sharp, and his mind was clear. He had waited his entire life for this moment. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "we are receiving a transmission from the alien fleet. The ones who were defending against the Kethvari. They want to talk." Chun nodded slowly. He had expected this. The Valorians. He knew all about them. Humanity had spent 8,000 years studying the galaxy through whatever signals could penetrate the quarantine field. They knew about the great empires. They knew about the ancient wars. They knew about the decision that had locked their entire species away like dangerous animals. "Let them wait," he said. "We have work to finish first." On the tactical display, his fleet continued its assault. 2,500 ships, the finest that humanity had ever built. Every vessel was a masterpiece of war. Heavy armor that could survive direct hits. Weapons designed through centuries of refinement. Crews trained from childhood for exactly this kind of combat. The Kethvari had never faced anything like them. The swarm was used to enemies who fought with elegant energy weapons and sophisticated shields. They were used to species who valued their own survival above all else. They had no experience with an enemy who used raw kinetic force and nuclear fire, who built their ships to take damage and keep fighting, who seemed almost eager to die as long as they took the enemy with them. Chun remembered the history lessons of his youth. 8,000 years ago, humanity had just begun to reach for the stars. They had built their first interstellar ships. They had made contact with the greater galaxy. And then the Valorian Empire had arrived. The Valorians had looked at humanity and seen something that frightened them. Not primitives, not savages. Something worse. They had seen a species whose entire history was written in blood. World wars, genocides, endless conflicts that stretched back to the beginning of civilization. The Valorians had decided that such a violent species could not be trusted with faster-than-light travel, could not be trusted with the secrets of the galaxy, could not be trusted at all. The quarantine field had gone up around the Sol system. Humanity had been told to stay in their corner of the universe and evolve past their violent nature. Perhaps in another few thousand years, they would be ready for the galactic community. Humanity had not taken this well. "Sir," the tactical officer said, "the Kethvari are attempting to reform their lines. They have stopped retreating, Chun studied the display. The swarm was indeed trying to regroup. The hive mind was adapting, learning from its defeats. It was pulling its ships into a tighter formation, concentrating its firepower. Good, Chun said. That makes them easier to hit. All ships, focus fire on the center of their formation. Break them apart. The human fleet responded instantly. Thousands of railgun rounds tore through space. Missile swarms darkened the sensors. The Kethvari formation shuddered under the assault, but it held. The hive mind was learning. Chun smiled grimly. Let them learn. It would not save them. For 8,000 years, humanity had been trapped in their home system. But they had not wasted that time. They had built. They had researched. They had prepared. Every generation had passed down the same message to their children. One day, the quarantine would fail. One day, humanity would return to the stars. And when that day came, they would be ready for whatever they found. The quarantine field had finally collapsed 3 years ago. Humanity had sent scouts through the gap, and those scouts had returned with terrible news. The galaxy was burning. A species called the Kethvari was consuming everything in its path. The great empires were falling. The Valorians, the same people who had locked humanity away, were facing extinction. The Human Council had debated for exactly 1 day. Then they had made their decision. Humanity would go to war. Admiral, the communications officer said again, the alien fleet is repeating their request for communication. They seem quite insistent. Chun finally turned away from the battle. Very well. Open a channel. The main screen flickered and a blue-skinned female appeared. She wore a military uniform covered in medals and insignia. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight braid. Her eyes were the color of pale gold, and they were filled with confusion and something that might have been fear. This is Admiral the Sara Vaughn of the Valorian Imperial Navy, she said. I wish to speak with whoever commands your fleet. Chun stepped forward. I am Fleet Admiral James Chun of the United Earth Expeditionary Fleet. I command this force. The Sara stared at him for a long moment. You are human, the quarantined species. We were quarantined, Chun agreed. We are not anymore. How did you escape? The field was designed to last for millennia. Your empire is dying, Admiral. The stations that powered the field have been destroyed, one by one, as the Kethvari advanced. 3 years ago, the field finally fell. We have been preparing for this moment ever since. The Zara seemed to struggle with this information. You came here to help us? Chun's expression did not change. We came here to destroy the Kethvari. What happens to your empire is not our concern. The words hung in the air between them. The Zara's golden eyes widened slightly. The Kethvari have been advancing for a century, Chun continued. We have watched them consume species after species. We have watched the great powers of the galaxy fail to stop them. And we have decided that this ends now. You cannot defeat them alone, the Sara said. They have millions of ships, billions of soldiers. They span 3 galaxies. We know. Chun smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We have been studying them for 3 years. We know their tactics, their weaknesses, their patterns. We know how they think. And we have built our entire military around one simple goal: killing them. On the tactical display, the Kethvari formation finally broke. Human ships poured through the gaps, destroying everything in their path. The swarm was collapsing, and the hive mind was screaming in confusion. Admiral Vaughn, Chun said, I suggest you keep your fleet clear of the combat zone. We would hate for any of your ships to be damaged by accident. This is our fight now. He cut the channel before she could respond. There would be time for diplomacy later. Right now, humanity had a message to deliver, and it was written in fire. All ships, Chun commanded. No survivors, no mercy. Show them what happens when you cage the wolves. The fleet surged forward, and the slaughter continued. The Kethvari Hive Admiral had never known fear. Fear was an emotion for lesser species, for the prey that the swarm consumed. The hive mind was ancient and vast, a consciousness that spanned 3 galaxies. It did not feel. It simply was. But now, watching the battle unfold through 1,000 eyes, the Hive Admiral experienced something new. Something wrong. The calculations were not working. The predictions were failing. The small enemy fleet should have been destroyed hours ago. Instead, the swarm was being torn apart. The Hive Admiral sent a command across the neural network. Reinforcements. It needed reinforcements. Every ship within range was ordered to converge on this location. The swarm would overwhelm the enemy with numbers. It always worked. It had to work. Across the Valorian sector, Kethvari vessels began to change course. Hundreds of ships abandoned their current targets and raced toward the battle. The hive mind was concentrating its forces, preparing for a massive counterattack. On the bridge of the Eternal Vigil, Admiral Lasara watched this happen with growing dread. "Admiral," her sensor officer reported. Reinforcements are arriving. 400 ships from the Tertius system. 300 more from the Valder frontier. They are converging on the human fleet. The Zara studied the tactical display. The humans had lost over 400 ships now. Their fleet was shrinking while the enemy grew stronger. It was only a matter of time before the numbers would overwhelm them. She opened a channel to the Thermopylae. Admiral Chun appeared on the screen, looking exactly as calm as he had before. "Admiral Chun," she said urgently. Reinforcements are arriving. You need to withdraw before you are surrounded." Chun glanced at something off-screen. "We are aware of the reinforcements, Admiral Vaughn. Thank you for your concern. You cannot fight them all. There are too many, are there?" Chun smiled. "Watch." The screen shifted to show a tactical view of the sector. The Zara saw the Kethvari reinforcements racing toward the battle. She saw the human fleet, still fighting, still killing. And then she saw something that made her heart stop. New contacts were appearing on the display. Not from one location. From a dozen different points across the sector. More human ships. Thousands more. "You did not think we would send just one fleet, did you?" Chun asked. "We've been planning this for 3 years. We have positioned forces across this entire region. Every approach, every escape route, every possible reinforcement path. We have them covered." The Zara watched as the new human fleets emerged from hidden positions. They were not rushing to help their comrades. They were positioning themselves to intercept the Kethvari reinforcements. The swarm was not converging on a weakened enemy. It was flying into a trap. On the throne world of Ethoria, Emperor Valdros III watched the same images through a quantum link. His advisors stood around him in stunned silence. None of them had ever seen anything like this. "How many ships do they have?" One advisor whispered that the Emperor did not answer. He was too busy counting. 12 separate fleets. At least 20,000 vessels in total. The humans had not come to help the Valorian Empire. They had come to fight a war, and they had brought enough firepower to do it properly. "They planned this," the Emperor said slowly. "They watched the Kethvari advance for years. They studied their patterns. They knew exactly where the swarm would send reinforcements from, and they positioned their forces accordingly." "But Majesty," another advisor said, "if they have had this capability for 3 years, why did they wait until now? They could have helped us much sooner." The Emperor looked at his advisor with sad eyes. "Because they wanted us to weaken each other first. The Kethvari have spent a century building their forces by consuming other species. We have spent a century bleeding ourselves dry trying to stop them. Now both sides are exhausted, and the humans arrive at full strength. The truth of it settled over the room like a cold wind. The humans had not come as saviors. They had come as opportunists. They had waited for the perfect moment to strike, when their enemies were at their weakest and their intervention would have maximum effect. Back at the battle, the trap was closing. The Kethvari reinforcements found themselves under attack from multiple directions. Human destroyers cut off their retreat paths. Human cruisers hammered their formations. Human fighters swarmed through the gaps, targeting command vessels and neural nodes. The Hive Admiral tried to adapt. It ordered its ships to scatter, to break into small groups that could escape the trap. But the humans had anticipated this too. Their fleets were flexible, breaking apart and reforming to pursue every fleeing group. There was no escape, thought something unprecedented happened. The Kethvari Hive Queen, commanding from her throne ship 1,000 light years away, felt the deaths of millions of her children. The neural network screamed with pain and confusion. For the first time in her ancient existence, she considered the unthinkable. She opened a communication channel. "Beings of the unknown fleet," she transmitted. "I am the Queen of the Kethvari. I wish to negotiate." Admiral Chun received the message on the Thermopylae. He read it once, then read it again. Around him, his officers waited in silence. "She wants to negotiate," Chen said. His voice was flat. "She has spent a century eating her way across 3 galaxies, and now she wants to negotiate." "Sir," his communications officer said carefully, "perhaps we should hear what she has to say. If we can end this war without more bloodshed." "More bloodshed?" Chun turned to face his officer. "Tell me, Lieutenant, how many species have the Kethvari consumed? How many civilizations have they erased from existence? How many billions of sentient beings have died screaming in their biomass vats?" The lieutenant had no answer. Chun opened a response channel. His message was broadcast across every frequency, heard by every species in the sector. To the Kethvari Hive Queen, "You do not get to negotiate. You do not get to bargain. You spent 1,000 years consuming innocent species. Now you face one that consumes back. There will be no peace. There will be no mercy. There will only be extinction." He closed the channel. "All fleets," he commanded, "continue the assault. I want every Kethvari ship in this sector destroyed by morning." The battle raged through the night. By dawn, 3,000 Kethvari ships had been reduced to debris. The swarm was broken, scattered, fleeing in every direction. Human losses totaled 847 vessels. Heavy losses by any normal standard. But the humans did not consider them heavy. They considered them acceptable. Admiral Dasara requested another meeting with Chun. This time, she did not warn him about reinforcements. She had only one question. What happens now? Chun looked at her through the screen. His eyes were tired but determined. "Now we finish what we started. The Kethvari have hive worlds across 3 galaxies. We are going to visit every single one of them. That will take years. Decades, perhaps. Then it takes decades." Chun leaned forward. "We waited 8,000 years for this chance, Admiral. We are patient. We are thorough. And we do not stop until the job is done." The channel closed. Dasara sat alone on her bridge, surrounded by her surviving crew, and wondered what kind of universe they would live in when the humans were finished. 3 months had passed since the Battle of the Crimson Nebula. In that time, the galaxy had changed more than it had in the previous 1,000 years. The human fleets had spread across Kethvari space like a cleansing fire. World after world fell silent. The hive ships that had terrorized the galaxy for a century were hunted down and destroyed. The Queen herself had tried to flee, abandoning her throne ship for a smaller vessel, hoping to hide among the stars. Human intelligence operatives had found her within a week. Her execution was broadcast across every network in the galaxy. The war was not over. There were still Kethvari remnants scattered across 3 galaxies, small swarms hiding in dark corners of space. But the threat was broken. The great hunger that had consumed so many civilizations would never rise again. Emperor Valdros III stood at the window of his private shuttle, watching the human flagship grow larger as they approached. The Thermopylae was enormous up close, a mountain of metal and weapons that dwarfed even the largest Valorian vessels. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant, but it was undeniably powerful. Majesty, his advisor said nervously. Are you certain this is wise? We know very little about these humans. They could be planning anything. They could have destroyed us already, Valdros replied. If they wanted our empire, they would have taken it. Instead, they have spent 3 months fighting our enemies for us. I think we owe them the courtesy of a conversation. The shuttle docked with the Thermopylae. Valdros and his small entourage were escorted through corridors that hummed with activity. Human crew members paused to stare at them, their expressions curious but not hostile. The Emperor noticed that many of them bore scars and injuries. These were people who had been fighting hard. Admiral Chun was waiting for them in a large conference room. He looked older than he had appeared on the view screen, more tired. But his eyes were still sharp, and his handshake was firm. Emperor Valdros, Chun said. Welcome aboard the Thermopylae. I apologize for the lack of ceremony. We are a military vessel, not a diplomatic one. I am not here for ceremony, Admiral. I am here for answers. Chun gestured for the Emperor to sit. Ask your questions. Valdros took a moment to gather his thoughts. He had prepared a dozen diplomatic speeches, but now they all seemed inadequate. Why? He finally asked. Why did you help us? After what we did to your people, you had every reason to let us burn. Chun was quiet for a long moment. I asked myself that same question many times over the years. When I was a child, I was taught to hate the Valorians. You locked us away. You called us dangerous. You left us to stare at the stars we were forbidden to reach. And yet, you came to our aid. Not to your aid specifically. We came because the Kethvari needed to be stopped. They would have consumed everything eventually, including us. We acted out of necessity. Chun paused. But there was something else too. What? 8,000 years is a long time to hold a grudge. Many generations lived and died under that quarantine. At first, yes, there was anger. There was resentment. But over time, that changed. We realized something important. The Emperor leaned forward. What did you realize? That you were not entirely wrong about us. Chun smiled slightly. Humans are violent. We have always been violent. Our history is soaked in blood. Your ancestors looked at us and saw a threat, and they were not imagining things. We were dangerous. But you have changed? No, we have not changed at all. We are still the same violent, stubborn, aggressive species we have always been. The difference is that now we understand ourselves better. We know what we are capable of. And we have learned to point that violence in the right direction. Valdros considered this. You are saying that you use your violent nature as a tool. Exactly. Violence is not evil, Emperor. It is not good either. It is simply a capability, like any other. The Kethvari use their capability to destroy. We use ours to protect. The intent matters. And what is your intent now? You have destroyed the greatest threat the galaxy has ever known. You have proven yourselves to be the most powerful military force in existence. What do you want? Chun stood and walked to a window. Outside, the stars gleamed in the endless dark. We want what we were denied 8,000 years ago. We want a place in the galactic community. We want to be treated as equals, not as animals to be caged. We want a seat at the table. That can be arranged. There is one more thing. Chun turned to face the Emperor. We want a promise. No species will ever be quarantined again for being different. No civilization will be locked away because it makes others uncomfortable. The galaxy will be open to all who wish to explore it. Valdros nodded slowly. That is reasonable. I will present your terms to the Council of Worlds. There is no need. The Council of Worlds no longer exists. Most of its members were destroyed by the Kethvori. Chen's expression softened slightly. We are not asking for your submission, Emperor. We are asking for your partnership. Help us build something new. Something better than what came before. The negotiations continued for several days. In the end, a new agreement was reached. The Galactic Compact, they called it. A union of surviving species, committed to mutual defense and cooperation. Humanity would be a founding member, with the same rights and responsibilities as any other species. News of the compact spread across the galaxy. For species that had spent a century living in fear, it was like the sun rising after an endless night. The Kethvori were defeated. The humans were allies. The future, for the first time in generations, held hope. 1 week after the compact was signed, Admiral the Saravan visited a human memorial ship. It was a vessel dedicated entirely to honoring the dead. The names of every human who had fallen in the war were etched into the hull. Millions of names covering every surface. Admiral Chung walked beside her as she moved through the ship. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of sacrifice. So many, the Sara said softly. So many lost. 847 ships at the Crimson Nebula. Another 12,000 in the campaigns that followed. Roughly 2 million personnel in total. Chun's voice was steady, but his eyes were sad. Every one of them knew they might not come back. They went anyway. The Zara stopped in front of a wall covered in names. Can I ask you something, Admiral? Of course. Why do humans fight so hard for species that rejected them? You could have stayed in your home system. You could have let the galaxy burn. No one would have blamed you. Chun was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Because someone has to. Because when we looked up at those stars for 8,000 years, we did not see enemies. We saw neighbors who needed time to understand us. He paused. We are patient, Admiral. We have always been patient. We knew that eventually we would have the chance to prove ourselves. We knew that eventually we would be needed. And when that day came, we wanted to be ready. You waited 8,000 years for a chance to help the species that imprisoned you. Yes, Chun smiled. That is what it means to be human. We do not forget. But we also do not let our anger define us. We are more than our worst impulses. We are more than our capacity for violence. We are beings capable of hope, of sacrifice, of love. We simply express these things differently than most. The Zara looked at him with new eyes. She had been taught her entire life that humans were dangerous, primitive, violent beyond reason. She was beginning to realize that her teachers had only seen part of the truth. What happens now? She asked. Now we rebuild. Now we explore. Now we take our place among the stars, as we were always meant to. Chun looked out at the galaxy through a nearby viewport. And we make sure that no species ever faces what the Kethvori did to you alone. From now on, when the darkness comes, humanity will be there to meet it. The Sara believed him. She had seen what humans could do in war. She was beginning to see what they could do in peace. Across 1,000 worlds, a new saying began to spread. It was whispered in taverns and shouted in celebrations. It was carved into monuments and taught to children. It became the defining phrase of a new era. Pray you never need the humans. But thank the stars they are there. The galaxy was no longer alone. And somehow, against all expectations, that was the most comforting thought in the universe.